we go.
Awesome.
Now you got your notice.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Elizabeth.
All right. Well, thank you, Melissa. Hi, everyone. So we call this a webinar. This is a traditional Zoom. I am very happy to engage with any comments or questions that you want to put in the chat or whatnot. You are welcome to leave your cameras off or on or whatever feels comfortable for you. I do have a few slides. So at some point, I'm going to start slide sharing, which means that you can only see about 4 people unless you change your screen. So but my plan for today is to we'll see how long I talk. I'll try not to talk too long, but I was thinking like 40 or 45 minutes. And then it would be great to hear from folks, hear thoughts, whether it's anecdotal information or other research you're aware of or you're working on. I think this provides us a small opportunity to do some sharing as well. So I'm very happy to engage with that, and we'll keep an eye on the clock so I can save some time for that as well. I will actually go ahead and share my screen so you can see my first slide here. Let's get my presentation going. All right. So you should see my presentation slide now. This is my title slide. So one of the things Melissa said in the introduction is that I really enjoyed co-editing the Oxford book on sexuality and emerging adulthood, and that's very broad, right? So that's looking at sexuality as a very broad, all things sexual and emerging adulthood, which is absolutely something that I'm interested in. What I'm focusing on today more is the sexual identity piece of it. And when I volunteered to do this, what I was really thinking that would be helpful for me and interesting for me, because so it's a little self-centered and selfish, is that I wrote an article for the journal Emerging Adulthood, the first edition that came out in the first volume, on sexual identity in emerging adulthood. And that was 10 years ago. And one of the things I keep thinking about, especially since I see that article being downloaded still, I'm like, well, stuff has changed, right? Stuff has changed societally, culturally. We have new research. And I notice updates, and I thought, okay, well, I can do a little mini update, and that might be kind of fun. So that was kind of my focus as I was preparing this today, was thinking about what are some of the updates that we have related to the last 10 years and what we're seeing. And it's not super comprehensive as far as everything that's out there, but I guess I pulled out a few fun facts that I was hoping to share with y'all today to give you that kind of a perspective. So this is my goal as far as coverage. I'm going to be a little bit heavy on the first 2 to 3, and I wanted to pull in some social context and well-being at the end. I think that's also kind of a good ending point to have more conversation about, but wanted to give you a little bit of background. So very briefly, some models and some concepts and terminology, starting there just to get us on the same page. I find identification labels and what people choose as representatives of their internalized understanding of their identity to be very fascinating. So I have a few conversation points I wanted to speak to about that. We are forever focused on milestones in sexual orientation identity research. So we've got to talk about those for better or for worse and go over some of that information as well. I find the complexities particularly interesting, so I will focus on lack of concordance in behaviors and other sorts of things related to that in what I decide to cover there. And then, like I said, kind of ending just with a reconsideration of social context and their importance there, a little bit about that, and also continuing to focus on well-being. As I was also reflecting on and preparing for this, kind of my background professionally, academically, realizing that this week, one of the things I run on my college campus is a safe zone workshop or program. So I speak to a lot of students and employees about increasing inclusivity and understanding of LGBTQ plus communities. And that sort of activism and work that I do is centrally guiding some of the research that I do as well. So you may sense that some of that pops into the conversations that I'm having about empirical work and how that can also help inform our ways to reduce inequality for members of this population, and continue to support well-being among emerging adults, particularly who are part of the LGBTQIA, with a little consideration of T and other gender identity issues in there as well. So you'll probably notice that. So that's the focus. That's where we're headed today. So I'll go ahead and move forward with the theoretical model discussion. One of the critiques of sexuality research in general is that much of it appears to be, or ostensibly is, a bit atheoretical in nature. We don't have, I mean, unless you want to go back to like Freud or Foucault, there's some, theories of sexuality that are out there, but they're not often brought in. More so what happens is there's some adjacent theory that helps inform our understanding of sexuality and is used. Now, there are a couple of notable exceptions that are a little bit focused, like theories of sexual possible selves, right, kind of pops in. So it's very sexually focused, but it's also focused on a very narrow area of sexuality as well. It can clearly inform certain research questions and endeavors, but not others. So, you'll see research broadly on sexuality and emerging adulthood, bringing in theoretical perspectives like social exchange theory, or things about sort of interpersonal connections, symbolic interactionism, like how do we learn to behave in the world, and how are we engaging in some of this performativity that's clearly informative in sexuality. There's a lot of performing that goes on there, but they're not explicitly focused on sexuality per se. So I'm giving that caveat, saying that the first theory that I do want to kind of talk about today, that I think is helpful for orienting our understanding of sexuality and sexual identity development, is a broader theory that is not sexually specific, but really helps us consider some of the questions and places that we want to focus as we think about sexual identity in emerging adulthood in particular, and that's life course development theory. So I wanted to kind of just make sure that as we're framing the research findings, as we're thinking about questions, a bit of my focus here comes from this perspective that we have, certain chronologically oriented but culturally driven stages that are happening in our lives, and that present us with new opportunities and new challenges, fun transitions to move from adolescence into emerging adulthood, and then moving from emerging adulthood out to middle adulthood, and other experiences, and just realizing that within this framework, we can be very we can benefit from understanding what's happening with emerging adults more broadly during this time. And one of the things that's happening with emerging adults more broadly during this time is identity development in general. Also considerations of sort of possibilities and optimism about future relationships that they may have, lots of opportunities for that kind of exploration to kind of figure out what works for you in your life, that kind of self-focused piece of it, right? That you can really kind of focus on understanding yourself, and working on behaviors and other sorts of things that allow you to do that kind of self-focused behavior, as well as some of the other kind of issues that come along with it, like some of the instability that again creates some possibilities and openings, but also can be a little bit less, feel a little bit disconcerting for members of this group. So interestingly there, I think sexuality has an important piece and a relevant piece for folks within emerging adulthood. So wanted to contextualize us, especially given this audience and population. And then in addition, the other thing that I draw on personally, and I think is relevant for thinking about this work, is some models of identity. So thinking about who we are. Traditionally, we've considered aspects of exploration and commitment at kind of a cornerstone of understanding identity. So asking those types of questions cognitively, enacting them behaviorally, and recognizing that this is not an emotional and a cognitive process, it's an individual process, but it's also relational and collective. So there's a lot going on in the formation of identities. And we can go through a number of different activities to help us understand and reaffirm or reconceptualize or shift or change our identities and our understandings of who we are. And that this is a big piece of thinking about sexual identity as well. And sexual identity is an interesting one because the term sexual identity doesn't naturally just mean sexual orientation, right? Though we tend to equate it that way. And when we think about definitions of sexual orientation, it's usually recognizing that orientation is multifaceted. Maybe it starts with biologically driven predisposition toward attraction to members of certain genders or sex. But we recognize there's other elements too. There's behavioral components, relational components, fantasy, desire, other things that go into our understanding of that, mixed with a number of other pieces of our of how we make sense of our experiences, how we interact with others. And so there's a lot there. Some folks have also recognized too that sexual identity can be more than orientation, and it absolutely can. And there are other pieces that are part of that. I'm kind of going to focus mainly on the orientation piece here for the most part, but realizing that there's a lot of other factors that intersect with that as well. So the other thing that we've often focused on too is sexual orientation, identity development among our more marginalized populations. So those identifying as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and then a handful of other identity labels that we'll talk about a little bit today too. Some research on heterosexual identity development, but clearly it's been pretty obvious that social and cultural contexts make those processes look different. And we also know as we start expanding out beyond that, that your gender identity matters as well. So whether you identify as a man, a woman, non-binary, transgender, or other gender identity as well, that those intersect very closely with experiences of sexual orientation, identity development, as well as other social categories and groups that you may identify with or be a part of, including race and ethnicity-based differences. Clearly, we also recognize that our overarching cultural context is mattering in here as well. So we often see differences between populations from different communities, regions, countries, and that sort of a thing as well. One of the other things that I think has been interesting, this is fun fact number one. We'll get to more fun facts too, but fun fact number one is, I think since I wrote the article about 10 years ago, one of the things that shifted a bit is more of a focus on romantic orientation in addition to sexual orientation. And so I wanted to mention that, and I'll pull it in a little bit as we go through some topics too, but I feel like it's gotten a bit more attention in the literature. It's often connected with asexuality, so a conversation of individuals who identify as asexual, but want to label a romantic or an affectionate affection-based orientation as well, to recognize I may not be sexually attracted to individuals, but here are the people who I am more romantically attracted to. But there's been some really interesting research looking at the concordance between romantic or affectional orientation and sexual orientation identity labels, finding that among individuals identified as heterosexual, there tends to be pretty high concordance with then a more heterosexual oriented, heteroromantic orientation. But once you start moving out of the heterosexual category, particularly as you get into some of the more liminal or in between sexual orientation identities, you see less and less concordance between that romantic or affection orientation and the sexual orientation labels. And I think that that's a really interesting new development in the field that deserves some more attention and recognition as we're talking about these topics, that the relational piece and the sexual piece don't always go hand in hand. All right, so what I think I'll do next is we'll kind of delve into some of the specifics of understanding sexual identity, development, considerations there as well. You know, one of the things that we do that I think is helpful as researchers is we like to label and categorize things. And as humans, we do that too. Our minds like to organize and categorize and label. But I would love to be able to attribute this quote to somebody. I don't remember where I read it, but it's not mine. But I think it's really interesting and important as we start talking about this topic that essentially the quote is that sexual orientation is more like height than eye color. So why do we keep measuring it in categories? And so I think that's an interesting place to start from, a recognition of the continuum of experiences with who we are and are not attracted to, who we are and are not behaving with, who we are and are not in relationships with, are all things that sometimes in our measurement we preclude some of the complexity that can be in there. So I guess that's my caveat before I get into talking about categories and labels. So let's talk a little bit about labels. Like I said, I think it's really interesting. So this chart here that I'm showing is from research that was done with US-based adults, and looking at cohorts between 2014 and 2021. So it's a cohort chart. So each of the different vertical dots are a different cohort, and looking at the rate of identifying as lesbian, gay, or bisexual among these cohorts of adults separated by age. So we are emerging adult focused in this conversation, which are the top two. The red line that you see up there is 18 to 24. And we can include our blue line as well, our 25 to 34-year-olds who are hanging out in that middle space there. And one of the things that you see across time is there are some changes in the rates in which folks in the US here are identifying as LG or B. Interestingly, as we look at that bottom yellow line, that's our 65 plus, we see pretty strong stability in how many 65-year-old pluses at 2014 identified as LGB, and same at 2017, and about the same in 2021. So not a huge adjustment as we get new folks into that category. And some of those other older age groups are the same, but it's pretty notable the trajectory that we're seeing, particularly among our 18 to 24-year-olds, higher rates of identification with these labels. So lots of thoughts on why this may be, maybe changing cultural acceptance. We, are seeing younger ages of identification. Maybe more options are coming out of identification labels that fit better with individuals. But there are a lot of potential reasons why we may see these changes, but I think that it in itself is a pretty interesting one as well. So some significant changes there. So that's cool. But one of the things I think is more kind of interesting fun fact is that we have better and better research over the last 10 years about things other than just the folks that fit in this LGB category and what they look like. So two things that I want to focus on is our bisexual plus population, and thinking particularly there about where they fall and where we see folks in other categories too. What this slide does is this slide presents to you recognition of kind of the proportion within the LGB community who identify as bisexual. One of the things we see here is that in this study, it was over half of our US-based adults identified that way, with the green bars pulled out show you more women identified folks identifying as bisexual than men. But the little arcs that are over there on the side are also showing you the age differences, and we're seeing a larger percentage of our emerging adults identifying within this category. So this is just from one study, but we see a lot of studies representing this as well, that a pretty significant proportion of our adolescents and our young adults specifically are selecting a bisexual or something other than bisexual label rather than lesbian or gay. So this is definitely a growing population and a significant portion of our LGB plus now grouping. And some other labels that fall in there are queer and pansexual and asexual as well. I have another chart for us too that this was actually, I was looking for some good visual representations, and I'm very proud of the Brown University Student Newspaper, because this comes from their research, but it corresponds with other stuff that we see too. But one of the things I can draw your attention to over toward the more recent fall and spring is how they get a little bit more colorful. And what's happening here is they're showing you that in addition to their originally measured heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, and other categories, which is the purple, blue, green, and yellow respectively, they clearly started adding in some other questions in the spring of 2022. Where they started adding some new colors, and you see those bars really kind of bump in there. So you see the addition of an orange bar, which are folks identified as queer. And so that's a pretty, solid line there amongst this US college population. You see red, which is our pansexual population in there. You see blue, which is the asexual population, and pink is the questioning population. So when you kind of go from the yellow all the way up to the pink, those are the kind of newer, different categories that people are like, oh, maybe we should ask about those now, that we didn't see as much 10 years ago. And they're really taking up a sizable chunk of that bar right there. And so I think it's helpful and important to realize that, especially our younger emerging adults, clearly those in a college population, are kind of significant in there. But it's not just college students as well. I've got a lovely pie chart here. And this pie chart shows you in a US adult nationally representative sample of where folks fell when they could include queer as an option and include other as an option as well. So the big dark maroon chunk is our lesbian and gay identified population. And then we'll go with taupe as the color for our bisexual group there, which is a sizable group too. So that's 47% and 41% respectively in those two groups. Then we've got two solid pieces of pie right there as well that include our queer. That's the kind of brighter orange population. And I'm getting my cheat sheet here because I forgot to put it on the chart. 6% in this US nationally representative sample of adults identified as queer, and then the others is other. But when we think about other, we've got a lot of other opportunities in there. We've got pansexual, we've got asexual, and we've got a whole slew of other identity labels that adults might be using there. So I think that that's really interesting. And we also, in addition to kind of teasing out these things, we have a lot more understanding of who's falling in that other category, who's falling in the queer category. It's mostly female identified individuals and mostly cisgender female identified individuals. But that said, it's relatively common to see genderqueer non-binary individuals falling into that category as well. So while the majority are women, cisgender women, the majority are young adults, about a third of our queer identified population also identified as non-binary as well. So there's some really important laps between particularly the queer and the pansexual population with gender identity and non-binary experiences as well. So that's pretty neat. To recognize that we have some better information on that now and can continue to understand these pretty significant populations of individuals who are not using what we might consider to be more of the traditional labels that we have more research on as well. Another thing that I think that research has been doing a better job at in the last 10 years is thinking about fluidity. So these charts right here are, if it makes your mind hurt, don't try to figure them out. I can kind of explain them. They're a little bit complex, but essentially what these charts are providing you is, this was an adolescent population that went up to 19 years old. So not totally emerging adult, but essentially what the bars are showing you is, as they went through these different waves of the study, who identified with which category. And as you look at something like, let's just take bisexual in the upper left for our non-heterosexual identities among boys, that top chart. What we would expect to see without any fluidity is that across those 6 bars of different levels of gray, they would be flat, right? So the same number of people across all of the waves, 5 waves that are represented here, identified as bisexual, but that's not the case, right? We see a change. So particularly in the last wave, as they hit emerging adulthood, we saw an increase in the number of folks who identified as bisexual. When we look at questioning, the same thing. If there was no fluidity in the labels, those bars would be at the same, say, percent that they were, 0.5% or 0.7% or 0.3% across all of the waves, but they're not. We see it go down and back up again. More folks in that emerging adult phase, right? As they go into it, pulling out that other, that's where the light gray bars popping up. Same thing with gay, a progress of how many people are identifying as gay. So it's not flat, changes. We see heterosexual go down and back up, and multiple sexual minority identities shifting too. So I walked you kind of across that top one with the boys, with the adolescent boys, and then down below is the one looking at the girls as they go through adolescence into emerging adulthood. Not exactly the same patterns, clearly, similar. I think one thing that's notable is when you look at lesbian identities, they are growing but are small among this group. Bisexual is much higher, and so is heterosexual plus a sexual minority identification too, though less than the boys up ahead. And as far as fluidity goes, we see some variation there. So walking you through that complexity, if you lost some of it, I think the take-home story is there is some fluidity that's happening, particularly through adolescence. And as we start heading into emerging adulthood, we're still seeing those changes, right? We're still seeing some fluidity. Other research that's been done with emerging adults shows that fluidity is definitely continuing through those early 20s and 30s. One of the things that, as we've gotten more and more research, appears to be pretty consistent, which I think is really interesting, is that the movement is often toward non-exclusive identities. So bisexual, pansexual, queer, heterosexual with another sexual orientation label associated with it, those types of things. And so that's becoming, I think, a more and more robust finding that we're seeing related to this research, particularly among women, but also among our young men as well. So that's a pretty distinct and important one to see. We have this research was done in the United States. I have seen a few studies that have been done in other places. We have a little bit of research out of Australia that shows fluidity there as well among our emerging adults. And so I think that's an important one to recognize as well. And that we've seen some fluidity in adult-based populations in European countries as well. And so we've got some good documentation now across that. All right, so we've kind of been focusing on the identity labels at this point. I want to move us a little bit more towards some of the behavior and milestones. We're now on bullet 3 of my outline, so I'm making progress. So as I mentioned, milestones were kind of a historical cornerstone of understanding sexual identity development. They continue to guide some of our research. They are not the only tool that should be used. There are other things to recognize in identity development, but I think they do provide some interesting points to take a look at. So let me tell you what's going on in this chart here. If you look down at the bottom, what you see are some of the common milestones that are assessed. So first, recognition of attraction to, say, a same-sex individual, the sort of realization of being different or realization of something, some kind of orientation other than heterosexual, which is still, especially in the United States, but cross-culturally kind of an expected starting point. Sex here refers to like a behavioral sexual experience, which is always tricky to define in different ways, but with a same-sex individual, a disclosure to a friend, a disclosure to family. We know those rates are a little bit different. People tend to disclose to friends or siblings before they tend to disclose to parents or other authority figures like teachers or coaches, and then entering into a relationship. So what this chart here represents then, as we take a look at the actual data that's represented in it, is different latent class analysis of folks with different profiles of when they went through each of these different milestones. What I take out of this is clearly there's not one path, right? We're not all doing it at the same age. Some folks are starting earlier, some folks are ending later, and that's existing as well. And then the other one I think is interesting when we look at the the one that they're calling middle adolescence. It's the second line up, the little dip between disclosure to a friend before the behavior. And so a recognition that these milestones don't always happen in the order here. But interestingly, in these classes, otherwise, they kind of did, right? Some corresponding at the same time, but most of these happen one after another. For those in that bottom line, the early adolescence, within sort of a 5-year period there. But when we look at the adulthood profile, that top line, we're seeing that attraction recognition a little bit before the age of 15, with then the disclosure to family closer to 30. The relationship a little earlier than that. Maybe that's what propelled them in 6 months later to go disclose to their family as a relationship. So we see elongated trajectories. A really neat study that I really like was one that was done with data from 28 different European countries that not only looked at these milestones, but looked at the cultural, political, structural climate within each of those individual countries to assess how much they basically operationalized a structural stigma in each of those countries. And they found that in the countries with higher rates of structural stigma, that there were longer elongated time periods between each of these milestones. So I think what that interesting finding was able to show was the cultural significance of moving from this realization and this attraction piece that can kind of be internal and still difficult to recognize or understand if you don't have cultural or models in order to put a name or a description on your experience, to the piece of actually engaging in the behavior, the disclosure to friends and family, and the relationship itself. And so that's a really interesting piece of research, I think, that did a nice job linking the milestones with sort of structural stigma as well. All right, so we see that. Another piece that goes along with kind of the milestones, and as we think about these, that makes it a little bit more complex, are some of the behavioral pieces as well. I think I mentioned at the beginning, I'm interested in the behavior, but I'm interested in when it doesn't quite fit, when it gets complicated, and that's what this chart shows. On the left, so this is a conglomeration of a couple different studies. So they're listed down at the bottom, so you can see one of them's the US-based National Survey of Family Growth, the Australian-based Longitudinal Study of Health and Relationships and Norwegian Living Conditions study. We have a couple there where they're looking on those first 3 columns at same-sex attraction. But then what I think is interesting is you look at the right-hand columns about same-sex behavior, and the rates are very different. And so it's interesting to me how we see, even among adult populations, that the behavior rates do not always match the attraction rates, and also do not always match the orientation label rates. It's very, very common to see high percentages of same-sex sexual behavior experiences among individuals who identify as heterosexual. So we have a lot of different research that shows that. We show that a lot of individuals with same-sex identities, lesbian, gay, have had other sexual experiences as well. And we see a lot of variation in the types of sexual experiences and relationship experiences among bisexual, pansexual, queer identified folks too. Fun fact that I've heard about, but I was able to do a little bit more research on in preparation for this too, was particularly in the US, we keep hearing our teenagers are having less sex. Our teenagers are having less sex. And I thought, all right, I need some really good, strong evidence related to that. I found it, but one of the things I found was like everyone's having less sex. So I thought that was interesting that across the US, we're seeing lower rates of sexual activity. But another qualification that I was able to see, again, this is among a US population, is that not only are our adolescents and young adults having less sexual intercourse, which is what I've heard, they're having less oral sex, they're having less partnered masturbation, and they're engaging in less solo masturbation as well, based on some research. And so I thought that that was really interesting that this shift has happened within the last 10 years or so. So in research done between 2010 and 2019, this is where we see that dip in behavior. It's pretty significant to see the rates. So for example, among adolescents with reporting no sexual activity, in 2010, it was 28%, and in 2019, it was 44%. So over that 10-year period, seeing a rise from 28% to 44% saying, I haven't engaged in any sexual activity. And so I think that that's really interesting and clearly informs sort of our understanding more generally, too, of what's happening within populations. We see a lot of complexity, like I mentioned, in our pansexual, our queer populations. We see who they're partnered with, who they're engaging in behavior with, shifts and changes. Gender identity matters a lot there too. Overarchingly, regardless of their identity label, our cisgender men are more likely to be with other men if they hold a identity label other than heterosexual. Whereas when we look particularly at our cisgender, as well as female assigned at birth, trans or non-binary individuals, there's much more of an equal split in who they are behaving or engaging in relationships with as far as the gender identity. Man, woman, or non-binary, and our queer participants are much more likely to be in relationships with non-binary individuals, and our pansexual individuals are similarly more likely than our heterosexual or gay or lesbian or bisexual participants as well. So a lot of really interesting complexity in who we're partnering with, who we're engaging in sexual relationships with based on our own identity labels, and the labels and gender of our partners as well. All right, so I thought I wouldn't have a lot of time for this, so I didn't prepare a whole bunch, but I need to give a nod to both social context as well as some outcome stuff. And then I am really hoping to hear from some folks and get some feedback and ideas on some of these topics. So I brought out an oldie but goodie to think about social context here, a recognition of this nicely complex, interlocking and tiered and embedded system of Grafenbrenner's ecological model, so that when we're thinking about sexual identity, thinking about sexuality and emerging adulthood, there's the individual recognition, and those interpersonal relationships are so important, those with our siblings, our peers, the messages we're getting from them about what is expected behavior related to gender and sexuality, our parents, as well as our religious institutions, our neighborhoods, and other things. We see some really interesting differences, even when you look within US populations based on ethnicity, of who teens are disclosing to. We see differences with some of our LGB Black youth being less likely to disclose to a peer, some of our LGB Asian youth being less likely to disclose to family. And so some interesting differences there based on race and ethnicity, thinking about that kind of intersection there of who and where they feel comfortable disclosing to. Overarchingly, our bisexual, pansexual, queer youth are less likely to disclose to other people across the board as well. And so there's some really interesting microsystem stuff going on with disclosure and clearly with relationships and behavior too, recognizing that mesosystem interaction as well. So maybe you're comfortable at school, but you're not comfortable at home. Segmented integration of identity has been sort of privileged as this positive thing. So when you have a gay identity that you can express maybe with your friends and at school, but you can't express it at home, or you can't express it in your religious institution, some of the challenges there as far as segmenting our identities apart there, as well as both in the United States and outside of the United States, we continue to see shifts and fluctuations in the political culture and the political climate, whether it's in laws that are enacted that disadvantage and discriminate against LGB, and especially in the US, we're seeing a lot of trans and other gender identity oriented discriminatory policies in our education system, in religious and government systems as well. Those are always embedded contexts that are going to influence these trajectories and experiences of sexual orientation identity, as well as the dimension of time. We did a little bit of time consideration here, looking at our cohort differences and realizing over the last 10 years, some of those climates and some of the media representations or awareness or conversations that are happening in schools may be actually shifting the timing and experiences of some of those identity milestones. That said, unfortunately, we do continue to see discrepancies in the well-being of our LGB plus emerging adults and youth. We often use a minority stress model to understand these differences, particularly health disparities, mental health disparities, differences in drug use, suicidality. My last slide here, a couple of the ones that I wanted to pull off is in this slide, we're seeing that on that top line there, LGB adults are more likely to experience psychological distress than their heterosexual counterparts, more likely to need medication for emotional health issues. Our trans adults in particular and our trans youth are reporting higher rates of suicide ideation, and both our trans as well as our LGB youth are much more likely to attempt suicide as well. So we have some continued significant well-being and health disparities that are experienced within this population that we're not seeing shift much, not seeing significant changes or inroads in those. It's possible that we're doing a better job of identifying and measuring them, but we're definitely not seeing a significant reduction in these. So with that, I am going to go ahead and stop my share. And I realize we have some nice comments in the chat here that we would be happy to address. And I can go over some of these are good. Sorry, I wasn't able to address them as I had my screen shared, but I can address a couple of them and go on from there. I know, Melissa, I mentioned SSEA. SSEA is the Society for the Study of Emerging Adulthood, and that's who put on this webinar. And I know Melissa put the organization website there. And so we're focused on emerging adulthood. So that's a reason that I focused on that. Brown University is a college in the United States. And so that's what, that was the sample of the slide that I saw in there. Oh, yep, Melissa did it too. Oh, yes. All right. Let me see if I can find that 2019 stats with the, with the lack of sexual activity. That was an interesting one. I'll have to find that as well. But I'm curious if other people have thoughts or questions or things that they wanted to share based on some of that information, other research you're aware of, things that you found interesting. Feel free to plop them in the chat or unmute yourself and go ahead and share your thoughts. Or we may have signed up from a webinar because you didn't want to participate, and that's okay as well.
Oh, yeah.
All right. We got a question there. So do we have an idea explaining the changes in identity shifts across the year? Yeah, I think it's a great question. So I'm thinking about like the identity labeling and how we may see more people identifying with particular groups. So I think it's multifaceted. I focus a lot on sort of the social context. And so because of that, my explanation goes there. Like, maybe 10 years ago, pansexual wasn't used as much of an identity label. And so individuals weren't necessarily aware of it, didn't feel like they had any label out there that fit very well to them. So they continue to identify as bisexual. Maybe they identified as lesbian. Maybe they even held on to a heterosexual label because there just wasn't something that resonated with them. As that label becomes more popular, more friends, more media, more blogs and online sorts of places where that term pops up and they become aware of it, we may see more people say choosing a term like pansexual because they're now aware that it exists. So I think that there's a piece of that in all of this, that this recognition of difference without a label for it means that you may not move into that label for a longer period of time. And so that's why we may see younger ages at identification and more people identifying with different labels. I also think that the climate, as well, as far as just society in general being slightly more accepting, if there's more people who are accepting, whether it's your own individual friends and family or teachers, or whether it's the fact that you see it represented in music, on social media, online, in TV shows, even though your current bubble is not very accepting, you may then be more likely to come out with or identify with a queer label or a lesbian label or an asexual label, because other folks, it appears to be more acceptable to you in whatever context that you're gaining your information from. So I think that the lower ages and the higher percentages are probably mostly related to that. And I say that because we know that a lot of sexual orientation is very biologically driven. So there's a lot of physiological things that are pushing our minds to understand them in a particular way. That said, of course, we can ignore our bodies and continue to identify in ways that maybe go against what our biological physiology told us, depending on social context and other reasons we might have for it. So those are some of my thoughts on the identity shifts as well. So Alan, I see that you're talking about the Kinsey tool. I do find it, but here's my issue with the original Kinsey scale, is the continuum moving from heterosexual to homosexual doesn't allow for that asexual option. And it doesn't allow, so that's why I like to separate them out. So you're like, I'm kind of like 0 to 100 other gender, 0 to 100 same gender. So you can be a 0 on both or moderate on one. And then I also like the addition that pansexual and queer really provide to us is this recognition of, you know, I might be very interested in men, sex assigned at birth, cisgender men. I might be more interested in trans individuals, right? I might be more interested in gender non-binary individuals, and that presentation and that experience is something that might be more attractive to me. So even the homosexual, heterosexual ignores the gender presentation or the gender identity. And so that's why I think making it a little bit more complex helps. But I love the continuums. I just want more continuums. That's all related to that. Yeah, so the sex education show on Netflix, right? So it's so interesting what's out there, that even if your family's not talking about it, you can find little ways to get some information, especially cross-culturally, right? Like what's going on in different cultural contexts and communities related to this stuff. Yeah, so I'm looking at the question about identity across adulthood, like in those different segmented age groups. Like, okay, so it's adults. Well, adults, essentially adults are usually like 18 to 65 or like 79. And so there's a lot going on during that age period. A little bit of the research I presented splits it out. I do try to find studies that pull out emerging adulthood. I think what I can say, the identity differences that we see is, actually here, well, like you just take a bisexual identity label, you're more likely to see about 2%, 1 to 2% of the population in a traditional adult, let's go with like 45, 50, 55, 60, identifying that way. When you ask a 20 to 25-year-old age group, do you identify as bisexual? You'll get 25, 30, 40% of them saying yes. So one of the big differences we see in identity labels across adulthood broadly is a much higher percentage of younger individuals. It's our Gen Z, right? Our Gen Z individuals who are identifying with some of these sexual minority or marginalized identity labels. And we're seeing them actually tick up that when you see like the nationally 8% of the population is LGBT, it's really like 4% of our 65-year-olds and 18% of our 20-year-olds, right? We do see some pretty significant age differences. So it's a super important question to have, because it does matter what group of adults you're looking at. So that's really important. So Y'all have good questions. Okay, so here's another question here. When you investigate sexuality, do participants have to choose a category label or do they write in their own? This is such a good question. I think a really helpful one to always consider. So there's actually been research that's been done on this. Like, what's the best way from sort of a methodological scientific standpoint, but also to help not alienate, disadvantage, or discriminate against your participants? So one of the things that I tend to do is I definitely allow write-ins. I often allow people to select multiple labels. Depending on my research question, I might ask them for a primary label. So like, what do you most identify with? And because it's very common for folks to select queer, bisexual, pansexual as their 3 identity labels. But then when you say what's your primary, they will pick one, right? And have sort of a primary identity label. So that's helpful. And then sometimes, like I mentioned on that continuum, I will also have people rate their attraction and their behavior on different rating scales as well, just to see how that may or may not correspond with those identity labels as well. So there's that. All right, let's see. We got a couple more questions here. How do we interpret the data on the first slide showing that more people identify as non-heterosexual? I think I was kind of trying to work on a, I don't know if you put that up there before I was talking earlier, but I think it really is about both the availability of models, right, of terms, and maybe changes in acceptance that are out there that I think is showing those higher rates across the years. Although it's more complicated than that, there's got to be other stuff going on as well. But I think that's sort of the primary one as well.
Hi, Shamika.
Oh. We have a question. Nope. Okay. All right. And so then the other question on here is how is the fluidities impacting a positive LGBT identity? That's a really good question. So I'm going to start with the idea that a lot of the research shows higher rates of reported stigma, discrimination, and negative views about one's own identity among our bisexual, pansexual, and queer populations. What's interesting is the fluidity is often moving toward those groups, right? So you may start off as identifying as heterosexual, move into a lesbian identity, and then end up with a bisexual identity. We do see higher rates of stigma reported among those groups. And I think that that's an important one to understand. And like I mentioned too, lower rates of disclosure, which naturally coincides. So we definitely want to be concerned about well-being, mental health, suicidality, experiences of discrimination, both internalizing and externalizing issues among folks who are in those categories. I think fluidity of sexual orientation is still not understood very well. And one of the interesting things is that folks in those categories like pansexual, bisexual, and queer often experience discrimination from within the LG plus community as well. So there are some kind of multi-factored issues that are going in there that are impacting well-being. And so I think that that's something that is maybe difficult for folks to describe or understand, especially when we don't have a really solid understanding. So from like a clinical implications perspective, recognizing that folks who are moving identities and in those bi plus plurisexual identities are likely to have more stigma. It's important to provide additional support for those folks, for sure. Oh, I like this question too, internalized prejudices. Absolutely. So there's great robust measures of internalized homophobia, and we see those as well as some of the external experiences of discrimination from other people too. Absolutely can create differences in how those milestones are progressing, so that awareness of and recognition of difference moving toward behavior and how someone maybe interprets the behavior. There's a lot of places where folks have studied individuals who engage in same-sex behavior but maintain a heterosexual identity. Sometimes that's related to cultural factors and internalized discrimination as well. I typically look toward the external because the internal is created by the external. We know we're not born thinking that being gay is bad. We learn it and then we internalize it. And so, we do see that though, a significant amount as we're thinking about it, and recognize that can postpone, delay, or otherwise create issues as folks are moving through identity development as members of the LGBT+ community as well. Yeah. It's a great point related to the terms. We see some general consistency in how people use terms as well, but we definitely see a difference in understanding of what of what queer means to each individuals. Cisgenders, when we have our sex assigned at birth aligned with our gender identity, our sense of ourselves and our gender. And I think the nice thing is that word is getting used a bit more, and folks are starting to learn that terminology a bit better as well. Some of our labels like pansexual might mean different things to different people. So it's always helpful to consider that as well, as we're thinking about that, but typically refers to an interest or attraction in other people on the basis of personality, and having a difference in openness, or a difference in attraction on the basis of gender, maybe gender presentation or gender expression, or sex assigned at birth as well. And so a couple of those terms in there are ones that I think are getting a little bit more understanding, but absolutely is helpful. So I'm sorry I didn't go over those to make sure everyone was on the same page. Related. People. Great. All right. Well, we are almost done with our time here. So I'm wondering if there's any other final questions before we wrap up. All right. Great. Well, thank you all so much for coming. I appreciate your participation and your excellent questions as well, and sitting and listening for a while. I hope it was helpful to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Morgan, for sharing your expertise with the Society for the Study of Emerging Adulthood network of scholars and practitioners. So we will have another webinar next month looking at some research talking about loneliness in emerging adulthood. So we're really excited about that webinar. So stay tuned to your emails for more details about signing up for that. And we hope to see you again in November.